Today, you guys are going to learn a little bit about terrorism in America. So this is just a brief primer. It's not intended to be entirely comprehensive. It's not going to cover everything regarding terrorism in America, but it'll give you an idea as to what terrorism is and why we're talking about this in terms of having our speaker come out from the Counterterrorism Education Learning Lab. Okay? So here's the definition of terrorism according to the CEL. And that is the Counterterrorism Education Learning Lab, of course. Terrorism is the premeditated use of violence or the threat of violence targeting civilians or their property for political, religious, or ideological gain. It is a tactic used to create an environment of fear, chaos, and intimidation in order to further the terrorist's objectives. Okay? So it's key that you guys understand that it's for political, religious, or ideological gain. Okay, so there's some motivation behind these acts or threats of violence. So you may want to pause the video to get this definition down, or you can choose to paraphrase it. It's up to you. So we're going to take a look at a few examples or a few scenarios, and we're going to think about which ones of these may count as acts of terrorism and which people from U.S. history count as terrorists according to the definition that we just got. So here are some people who could technically qualify. So we have Nat Turner and Nat Turner's Rebellion. And if you remember, that happened in 1831, and it happened in Virginia, where Nat Turner led a group of slaves, and it grew to be about 60 to 70 slaves that wound up joining him. And what he did first is he murdered his master and his master's family, and then he went and seized a bunch of weapons, and he got slaves to join him along the way, and they wound up killing about 60 white people. And then we've got John Brown. John Brown was an abolitionist, and he is one of the men who went to Kansas when it was called Bleeding Kansas, because people were fighting over whether Kansas was going to be free or slave as a state. And so John Brown and his sons wound up killing 5 men who were pro-slavery. And later on, he went to lead a raid on Harper's Ferry on the East Coast. And that was designed with the idea in mind of getting slaves to join up and rebel against their masters and to be free from slavery. And then we have Nathan Bedford Forrest, and he was a general on the side of the Confederacy in the Civil War. And he was the first Grand Wizard of the KKK. Then we have Earth First. Now, Earth First is a group that organized and started up in the 1980s, and it was intent on stopping the logging that was going on in our forests throughout America. And what they would do is they would oftentimes put spikes into trees to make it so that loggers could not just go and chop them down quickly with their equipment. And they also were responsible for sabotaging and ruining a lot of equipment that loggers used. And then you have the Earth Liberation Front. Now, this is a group that started up in about 1997. And this group was, they did a lot of arson, which meant they set a lot of things on fire, including there was a resort that here in Colorado, in Vail, they wound up setting fire to it and causing $12 million in damage because they were protesting the destruction of the environment that the ski resorts were causing. And then finally, we have Michael Griffin. He is one of a few men who was an anti-abortion person. So he did not believe in the practice of abortion, and he actually wound up murdering a doctor in Pensacola, Florida, who was performing abortions legally for women. And he was convicted of murder. So which ones qualify? Well, all of these people or groups fit the definition. However, in the cases of Nat Turner and John Brown, history does not remember them all as terrorists. So history does not tend to think of Nat Turner or John Brown as terrorists because they were fighting for causes that we know today that are right or true. So how this applies to our slavery unit and why we're talking about this. So slavery induced this climate of fear, right? And it was basically fear, and it was like a horrible system of intimidation and power of white people over black people throughout the South, throughout the slaveholding states. Okay? And it was a desire on the part of some Southerners to retain social and economic power over African Americans who were freed after the end of the Civil War. So there were some white people who felt kind of left out and kind of left behind, and they were worried about whether or not they would have enough money because their slaves had been freed and so much money had been invested in the manpower of slavery, right? And so basically they were motivated to continue to have these horrible racist attitudes, which some of which has continued through today. And then we've also, we saw intimidation to prevent African Americans to attain and enjoy their full rights as citizens. So even though African Americans were given the right to vote after the Civil War, and even though they were given the rights of citizens, they still were prevented from exercising some of those rights. There were all kinds of terrible things that were done to prevent them. So now we've got John Brown. I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about this. You're going to want to get down a little bit of information about him, okay? So you may want to take down some notes. So John Brown, terrorist or hero, right? Well, according to history, generally speaking, he's regarded as a hero, someone who was fighting for a cause that we know is right, abolition. He was a conductor on the Underground Railroad in the early 1850s in New York, and then he wound up going to Bleeding, Kansas, and he wound up killing those 5 men that I mentioned along Pottawatomie Creek, okay? So he killed these pro-slavery settlers, these pro-slavery men, in retaliation for something that was going on in Lawrence, Kansas, where anti-slavery settlers were being threatened and attacked. Later on, Brown led some raids on plantations in the South, so he was trying to disrupt slavery throughout the South. And then when he decided that wasn't enough, he decided in 1959 that he was going to go ahead and raid Harper's Ferry, which was a major armory and held a lot of weapons. And he was going to fight for the cause of abolition and arm the slaves. That was his hope, is that slaves would rise up and fight alongside him to free themselves. Brown was captured. It was considered sort of a treasonous act at the time against the country. He was put on trial and he was executed. And his actions were one of the sparks that really started the Civil War. So, let's talk a little bit about the Ku Klux Klan, okay? And this is something that emerges after the start of the Civil War. And so, or after the end of the Civil War, sorry. So the origin of the name, in case you're wondering, well, what does Ku Klux Klan mean anyway? It comes from the Greek word kuklos, which means circle. So it's the circle of brotherhood. Now, the Ku Klux Klan started up after the Civil War really as a social group, which is kind of weird. These 6 Confederate veterans got together and they started hanging out together, and then sometimes they would dress up as ghosts of Confederate soldiers. So they'd wear these sheets and they'd put sheets on their horses and they'd go parading around through the town. Well, then they started to realize, oh, wow, we're really intimidating a lot of African Americans in our community. Maybe we could use this as a method to suppress their rights. And so in 1867, Nathan Bedford Forrest, who is this gentleman who you see over here, or this man you see over here, and I'm sure I should call him a gentleman, he was the Grand Wizard of the KKK. He was appointed. So this started up in Tennessee. And then when they realized that they were being successful in their intimidation tactics, they continued to do that. And basically, they recruited a lot of people who were white and who were angry because they felt like they were losing their social status and they were losing money. And they were afraid of losing jobs to African Americans too, at least the poor whites were. And so they started joining up. And then when they started to become violent, that's when Congress decided that they needed to put a stop to this somehow. Because in Georgia alone, in 1868, there were 336 cases reported of murder or assault with the intent to kill. Those are the ones that are reported, mind you, okay? So not everything was reported to the authorities. But basically, Forrest goes to testify before Congress about what's going on with the Klan, and he tried to disband it, and he said that he'd had enough because it had become too violent. But the damage was really done because there were a lot of people who held these white supremacist views, who decided to continue these intimidation tactics, even if it wasn't under the banner of the Klan. And they worked hard to limit the voting rights of African Americans and also tried to keep African Americans from buying land. And so the Ku Klux Klan Act in Congress in 1871, they put this into place, and it was designed to prevent the further spread of the KKK and also to try to wipe it out. And so basically it put into place a lot of harsh penalties if you were caught doing some of these activities. One thing to know, though, is that even though they say that the Ku Klux Klan Act was, that it actually worked, lynching still continued, and they actually increased between 1880s and the 1890s. And lynchings are basically, they're an attack by a mob on an African-American person. There were all kinds of terrible things that were done where a lot of black men primarily were killed. And this was in front of a mob, and sometimes it would even kind of be a social event for white people. Really awful stuff. So second wave of the KKK. We had a Methodist minister in Georgia who decided to reorganize the Klan in 1915. And so they engaged in night riding, which again is the thing where they put on sheets and they ride around on horses and that kind of stuff in the middle of the night to try to terrorize people. And then also they engaged in a lot of lynchings, which I just mentioned. So this is a horrible fact. There were 2 U.S. presidents who are known Klan members. There was Warren G. Harding, and then more recently there was Harry Truman, who was the president after World War II. So the second wave really started up around 1915, and it went until the kind of the end of World War II. That was really fading out at that time. But there was a movie called Birth of a Nation, which debuted in 1915. It was a major motion picture that a lot of people went to watch, and it reinforced a lot of negative, harmful stereotypes and really romanticized the Old South in the movie. So it was really terrible stuff, but a lot of people were drawn to this, and so membership in the Klan rose to an all-time high. So in 1924, there were actually 6 million people in the United States that considered themselves members of the KKK. But the KKK at that time didn't only limit itself to hatred of African Americans. It also added Catholics. It added immigrants. It added Jews, communists, or anybody who could be seen as a threat to the white Protestant way of life. Now, the third wave of the KKK started after World War II. Now, you can see over here on this map, this is kind of scary. And that's an understatement. So here, all the dark patches are basically where there were known cells of the KKK that were active. Okay, and this was during the time of the 1960s when the civil rights movement was in full swing. So there were active chapters in places like Mississippi, in Jacksonville, Florida, in St. Augustine, Florida. You'll notice there's a lot of activity over in here, right? Which is Jacksonville's, that's where it is, and St. Augustine too. Birmingham in Alabama and Montgomery in Alabama. And that's where Martin Luther King was trying to make a lot of change. And Rosa Parks too. There were a lot of activists coming out of that part of the country who were doing a lot of really good work. And so largely the KKK at that time was in reaction to the civil rights movement and African Americans asserting themselves and trying to get the rights that they deserved. And so some of the methods that the KKK used during this time is they used bombings, like of churches and things like that. There were also assassinations, like the assassination of Martin Luther King. There were murders, oftentimes of civil rights workers who were trying to go around and get people signed up for their voting rights. There were lynchings, fire bombings, kidnappings, and many other means of terror and intimidation. So I want to talk about 2 things that are recent, okay, involving white supremacist activity. One involves Dylan Roof, who was 21 years old, and he went into an African-American church in South Carolina in 2015 and killed 9 people who were worshiping there. On his website, it had images of the Confederate flag and also hate speech and other things. And so it wound up with the removal of the Confederate flag from the South Carolina State House, which is where it had flown oftentimes, which is pretty crazy. And then in Charlottesville in 2017 in Virginia, there was a white supremacist rally called Unite the Right, and it turned violent. And basically, it was all about the removal of the statue of Robert E. Lee, which a lot of